Disconnected dreams. Ethan Porter sat behind the oversized oak desk in his corporate office, his fingers drumming restlessly on the glossy surface. His name was etched into a gold plate near the edge, a symbol of the success he had built over the last 15 years. Ethan had started Porter's Grill and Go with nothing but a beat-up food truck, a secret fried chicken recipe from his grandmother, and a stubborn refusal to quit. That truck had become a small shack, then a store, then a chain. And now it was a regional empire, with 19 locations sprawled across 3 states. But success had a weight to it. The numbers were still decent. Profit margins, food costs, customer counts. On paper, things looked stable. But Ethan had learned the hard way that the heart of a business couldn't be found in a spreadsheet. For the past 6 months, the complaints had been rolling in at a rate too high to ignore. Reviews on social media painted a grim picture: rude staff, cold food, slow service, indifferent managers. He read comments that stung more than he wanted to admit. Porter's used to be my go-to, but the staff acts like they hate being there. I waited 20 minutes for the wrong order, and the cashier rolled her eyes when I asked for the right one. It's just not the same anymore. Ethan leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He hadn't set foot in one of his own restaurants in over 2 years. At first, it was pride. He had built a system, a franchise model. His managers had training, there were standard operating procedures, and corporate oversight was firmly in place. But processes on paper didn't always translate to reality. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost touch. The final blow had come last week, when an anonymous email landed in his inbox. The subject line read simply, "If you care, show up." The message was short but brutal. "You sit in your office making decisions about us, but you've got no idea what it's like here. The managers treat us like garbage. Customers complain and no one listens. People quit every week, and the rest of us are too tired to care anymore. Maybe if you saw it for yourself, you'd understand why Porter's is dying." Ethan had sat there for almost an hour, just staring at the screen. The words felt personal, like a slap to the face, and a hand pulling him out of the fog, all at once. He didn't forward the email to HR. He didn't even reply. Instead, he made a decision. That was why, 1 week later, Ethan stood in his bedroom mirror, barely recognizing the man staring back at him. The slick hair, expensive suits, and crisp white shirts were gone. In their place, a worn hoodie, faded jeans, and a trucker cap pulled low over a face that was now framed by 2 weeks' worth of patchy beard growth. He was going in undercover. It was easier than he expected. No one working the counters or fryers today would recognize the man who graced the annual company newsletters. Few of his employees even knew what he looked like outside of corporate headshots. He had become an invisible CEO, a figurehead in a distant tower. That anonymity, for once, worked to his advantage. As Ethan pulled into the parking lot of the Heartwarming location, he sat in his car longer than necessary, watching. The neon sign flickered slightly. No one had fixed it. The trash cans near the door overflowed, with soda cups and burger wrappers spilling onto the sidewalk. A teenager in a crinkled apron leaned against the side of the building, furiously vaping behind a dumpster. None of it should have surprised him, but it did. The place was busy. Not packed, but steady. The drive-thru was backed up, and inside, customers clustered near the counter, their body language practically shouting frustration. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped inside. The smell was familiar: fried chicken, hot oil, and cheap coffee. The energy, though, was not. The tension in the air was thick, like everyone, customers and staff alike, were just waiting for something to go wrong. The cashier, a young woman with dark circles under her eyes and a name tag that read Melissa, barely glanced up. "Welcome to Porter's," she said, the words sliding out of her mouth like she was reciting from memory instead of greeting an actual person. Her smile, if you could call it that, flickered for half a second before vanishing. "Hey," Ethan said, keeping his voice casual. "Can I get a number 4 combo, extra sauce?" Melissa punched in the order without asking if he wanted fries or onion rings. Without looking up, she muttered, "That'll be $9.82. Ethan handed her a crumpled $20. Her fingers trembled slightly as she counted out change, and in the pause, Ethan heard it, a sharp bark from the back. "Melissa, move your ass. These orders aren't gonna make themselves." The voice belonged to a man, older than the rest of the crew, his manager's polo stained at the collar. His name tag read Rick Hickey, and the way he loomed behind the line, arms crossed like a drill sergeant, made Ethan's stomach tighten. Melissa flinched, her cheeks flushing red as she stuffed Ethan's change into his palm and turned toward the fryer. Ethan stepped aside, pretending to check his phone while his order was prepared. From the corner of his eye, he saw everything. The sloppy assembly line, the half-hearted teamwork, the way Rick hovered like a predator, calling out mistakes loud enough for customers to hear. Cold fries again. How hard is it to drop a fresh batch? Table 4's been waiting for 15 minutes. Do any of you care? This is why nobody eats here anymore. Ethan's stomach twisted into a knot. But then came the moment that hit him hardest. Rick leaned close to Melissa, too close, and said, just loud enough for Ethan to catch, "The only reason you're still here is 'cause corporate's afraid to fire anyone." Some sob story about diversity quotas or whatever. "If it were up to me, you'd be gone." Melissa's hands shook, her eyes locked on the floor, her knuckles white where she gripped a tray. She said nothing. She didn't defend herself, didn't ask why. She just swallowed it like poison, like she was used to it. Ethan's heart dropped into his stomach. This wasn't a bad day. This was the culture now. He took his tray, but his appetite had vanished. He sat at a corner table, barely noticing the lukewarm fries and over-salted chicken sandwich. He had built this place. His dream. His name was on the building. But somewhere along the way, he'd lost control. And this was what had filled the vacuum. A system that rewarded bullies like Rick and crushed employees like Melissa. He couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Ethan Porter, CEO, was going back to square one. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Beneath the surface. The next morning, Ethan was already parked in the lot of Porter's Grill and go before the sun even cracked the horizon. The sky was bruised purple, and the neon sign flickered weakly overhead, one of the letters struggling to hold on. In the quiet stillness of dawn, the restaurant felt even smaller, just another fast food joint in a sea of sameness. Ethan leaned back in the driver's seat, sipping a gas station coffee that tasted more like burnt cardboard than anything remotely caffeinated. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Emails, calendar notifications, reminders for meetings he no longer cared about. The Ethan Porter sitting in that car wasn't the CEO with a corner office and a polished reputation. He was a man standing at the edge of his own creation, unsure if he even recognized it anymore. Today wasn't just about observing. Today, Ethan was going in as one of them. The disguise deepens. He'd spent the previous night assembling a new identity. Ethan Price, a down-on-his-luck guy looking for part-time work. His corporate credit card had covered a cheap pair of scuffed-up work boots, khaki pants, and a navy blue polo with the Porter's Grill logo slightly faded from too many washes. He even had a fake application printed out, scribbled with made-up employment history, warehouse work, short order cook, a few gaps in between. Enough to make him look ordinary, unremarkable, invisible. That was the goal. Ethan stepped inside the restaurant just as the early morning shift was gearing up. The kitchen lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh fluorescent glare. The air was thick with the scent of fryer oil and bleach, a cocktail of early morning prep work and last night's desperation. Behind the counter, Melissa was already there, wearing the same tired expression she had the day before. Her hair was pulled back into a ponytail that was already slipping loose, and her uniform shirt had a faint mustard stain near the collar. She looked up when the door chimed, her expression flickering through surprise, recognition, and finally, disinterest. "Back already," she muttered. "Couldn't get enough," Ethan said with a small smile, keeping his voice light. "Actually, I saw the help wanted sign last night and figured I'd try my luck." Melissa blinked, clearly caught off guard. "You want to work here?" "Need the hours," Ethan said with a shrug. "Figured it's worth a shot." Before Melissa could respond, Rick emerged from the back. His heavy footsteps hit the tile like hammers, and the sour look on his face hadn't softened overnight. "What's this?" Rick demanded, eyes scanning Ethan up and down. "You looking for a job?" "Yeah," Ethan said, extending the folded application. "Part-time, whatever you've got." Rick snatched the paper without really looking at it. "Fine. You got a pulse. You're hired. Don't you need to check references or anything?" Ethan asked, half amused and half horrified. Rick snorted. "I don't have time for that crap. Just show up when I tell you, and don't screw around." And just like that, Ethan Porter, founder and CEO, was officially on his own payroll. The reality of the line. Ethan's first task was simple: dishes. The dish pit was tucked into the back corner of the kitchen, a narrow space with a rubber mat so worn it was practically part of the floor. The sink was filled with cloudy water, a film of grease floating on the surface. As Ethan plunged his hands into the water, his sleeves already damp with fryer oil, he listened. He listened to the clatter of metal trays, the shouting of orders, the whispers of frustration. Conversations happened in snatches, complaints about hours being cut, speculation over who would quit next, inside jokes that masked real exhaustion. "Hey, new guy," a voice called. Ethan turned to see a teenager, probably 16, with acne scars and a name tag that read Kyle, leaning against the counter. "You forget to piss off Rick yet?" "Working on it," Ethan replied. Kyle grinned, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Don't worry. He'll hate you soon enough." It was said like a joke, but it wasn't. The morning rush. The first real test came at 8:15, when the breakfast rush hit. Customers flowed through the doors in a slow, steady stream. Commuters grabbing coffee and sandwiches, construction workers ordering in bulk, a handful of families looking for quick meals before school drop-offs. Ethan was pulled from the dish pit and handed a headset. "Drive-through's your problem now," Rick barked. Ethan slipped on the headset, the foam ear pads crackling with static. "Welcome to Porter's Grill and Go. Can I take your order?" The first voice was already impatient. "Yeah, 2 sausage biscuits, hash browns, and a large coffee." "Would you like cream or sugar with that?" "Just the coffee. And hurry up." Ethan punched in the order, but the register interface, a clunky, outdated relic, lagged half a second behind his fingers. It was a small thing, but when every second counted, even tiny delays stacked into frustration. From the corner of his eye, Ethan saw Rick standing with his arms crossed, watching, judging. "Move faster," Rick barked. "It's not rocket science." Ethan gritted his teeth but said nothing. This was the culture Rick had built, a stew of stress, blame, and fear. Behind him, Melissa moved quietly, refilling sauce dispensers and wiping down counters. Ethan noticed the way her eyes flicked to Rick every few seconds, like a dog expecting a kick. When words cut deeper than blades. The moment that turned Ethan's stomach came just before the end of breakfast service. A customer, a middle-aged woman with a purse the size of a suitcase, approached the counter, her face already set in a scowl. "This sandwich is cold," she snapped, slamming the paper bag down. "I'm not eating this garbage." Melissa stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "I'm so sorry about that, ma'am. I can get you a fresh one right away." "Should have been fresh the first time," the woman muttered, but she relented. Melissa turned to the fryer, but Rick's voice cut through the kitchen like a whip. "Figures you screwed up again, Melissa. It's like watching a sloth make sandwiches." Melissa's shoulders hunched inward, her fingers curling around the fryer basket handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. Ethan's stomach dropped like a stone. It wasn't just the words. It was the ease with which Rick said them, like this was normal, expected, acceptable. Ethan felt his pulse hammering in his ears. He wanted to rip off his headset, tell Rick exactly who he was, and fire him on the spot. But that wouldn't fix the deeper rot. This wasn't just about one bad manager. This was the culture Ethan had allowed to grow when he wasn't looking. And now, it was his job to fix it, from the inside out. The first step. At the end of his shift, Ethan was wiping down tables when Melissa approached, her hands twisted nervously in her apron. You did pretty good today," she said, her voice quiet. "Thanks," Ethan said. "How long you been here?" 2 years, Melissa said. "Feels like longer." "Why stay?" She hesitated. "Because leaving means starting over. And sometimes it's easier to just survive." Ethan swallowed hard. Maybe surviving's not enough. Melissa looked at him, confused, but before she could respond, Rick's voice bellowed from the kitchen. "Melissa, break's over. Move it." She gave Ethan a tight smile and walked away. Ethan stood alone, the weight of her words settling like bricks on his chest. Surviving wasn't enough. Not for her, not for anyone. And if Ethan Porter wanted to fix his company, he couldn't just be the CEO. He had to be the man who built it all over again, cracks in the foundation. The evening shift was always different. The morning crowd was predictable, workers on their way to their jobs, parents rushing kids to school, regulars whose orders the staff could recite from memory. But the evening was chaos. Families with screaming toddlers, teenagers looking for a cheap hangout, and the occasional angry commuter taking out their day on a minimum wage cashier. Ethan stood near the fryer station, his arms already sore from a shift that had stretched far longer than expected. Sweat clung to his back under the cheap polyester uniform, and the smells of burnt oil and processed meat seemed permanently embedded in his skin. But it wasn't the physical labor that wore him down the most. It was everything else. The constant tension, the sideways glances between employees, the subtle dance everyone did to avoid Rick's attention. Ethan could see it now, how fear shaped every action, every choice. No one stayed longer than they had to. No one spoke unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't a workplace. It was a battlefield. Behind closed doors. Mid-shift, Ethan found himself in the small, windowless employee break room, a space that was more storage closet than relaxation area. A battered table stood in the center, its surface scarred with initials carved into the wood. One of the fluorescent lights flickered above, and the air conditioning vent rattled like it was on its last breath. Melissa sat in the corner, eating a cold sandwich she'd hastily assembled from rejected orders. Her shoulders were hunched, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds, as if she expected Rick to barge in and scold her for taking even a moment of peace. "Hey," Ethan said, dropping into the chair across from her. Melissa stiffened, clearly not used to casual conversation with her coworkers. "Hey," she mumbled, eyes locked on the sandwich. Ethan leaned back, trying to appear relaxed. "So, you've been here a couple years, right?" Melissa nodded, her fingers picking at the crust of her sandwich. "Yeah, started when I was 17. Ethan let the silence stretch a moment before asking, "What keeps you here?" Melissa's mouth twisted into something halfway between a smile and a grimace. "Bills. My mom's sick, so I help out. My little sister's still in school, so someone's got to pay for stuff." There was no bitterness in her voice, just the flat acceptance of someone who's had no choice but to grow up too fast. "You ever think about leaving?" Ethan asked. Melissa gave a humorless laugh. "Every day. But jobs around here, they don't pay much better. And at least here I know how bad it is. Some places, it's worse." Ethan swallowed hard. There was a resignation in her voice that hit him deep. His restaurants, The company he had once called his pride and joy had become the devil people knew. A paycheck that came with constant humiliation was better than gambling on the unknown. The weakest link in the chain. The next crisis came during the dinner rush. A slip-up in the supply order. The shipment had arrived that afternoon, but no one had properly stocked it, leaving the kitchen scrambling to find basic ingredients mid-shift. "Where the hell's the coleslaw mix?" one of the line cooks shouted, slamming the fridge door with unnecessary force. "I thought you stocked it," another cook snapped back. Rick stormed in from the back, his face already flushed with frustration. "Are you all brain dead? I have to do everything around here." Melissa, still at the register, kept her eyes down, pretending not to hear, but Ethan saw the way her hands trembled as she counted change. "Who was in charge of the shipment?" Rick demanded, voice rising. No one answered. Ethan's gut churned. This was it. Every mistake, every tiny hiccup, became an excuse for Rick to lash out. He didn't manage problems. He weaponized them. "I swear to God," Rick growled, "if I catch one more screw-up, someone's out the door." But no one knew what to fix, because no one was ever properly trained. Mistakes piled up because no one felt safe enough to ask questions. Everyone just learned to keep their heads down and survive until payday. A private conversation. Later, when the dining room quieted and the kitchen settled into the slow hum of post-rush cleanup, Ethan found Melissa restocking the drink station. "Hey," Ethan said quietly, "can I ask you something?" Melissa hesitated, but nodded. "How do you deal with it?" "The way Rick talks to everyone." Melissa's shoulders lifted in a weary shrug. "You just get used to it." "That's not how it should be." She gave him a sideways glance. "Yeah, well, it is. What if someone reported him?" Melissa's hands froze on the stack of lids she was organizing. "To who?" "Corporate doesn't care. I've seen people call the hotline or email HR. Nothing ever happens." Ethan's chest tightened. So the complaints had been coming in, and they were being buried. Somewhere between Melissa's voice and Ethan's desk, the truth had been lost. "What if someone at corporate actually listened?" he asked. Melissa gave him a small, sad smile. "I'll believe it when I see it." The paycheck trade-off. At the end of the shift, Ethan stood beside Melissa near the back door, both of them waiting for their rides. Her for the city bus, him for the car he parked down the block to avoid suspicion. The night air was thick and humid, the smell of fryer grease lingering even outside. "Hey," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "Can I ask one more thing?" Melissa sighed but nodded. "Sure. If you could change one thing about this place, what would it be?" Melissa's brow furrowed, like the question hadn't even occurred to her. "Just treat us like people, you know. Not robots. Not screw-ups. Just people trying to do our best." Ethan felt the answer lodge deep in his gut. "Sounds fair," he said softly. Melissa glanced at him sideways. "Why do you care so much anyway? Most new guys don't last a week." Ethan forced a smile. "Guess I just figure, if I'm gonna work here, I might as well try to make it suck a little less." Melissa didn't smile back, but she didn't argue either. The invisible CEO's realization. That night, Ethan sat in his car long after the parking lot emptied. His phone buzzed with texts from his assistant, reminders of meetings, proposals needing signatures, sales reports awaiting review. None of it mattered right now. Ethan had built Porter's Grill and go to be a place where good food and good people came together. But now, it was just another machine grinding people down for the sake of speed and profit. He had seen it, the fear in their eyes, the exhaustion in their bodies, the walls they built to protect themselves from managers like Rick. This wasn't leadership. This was survival. The system he thought would protect his vision had suffocated it instead. Ethan stared at the neon sign flickering above the building. His name, barely visible through the half-burnt bolts. This was his fault. And if he didn't fix it, it would be his legacy. Tomorrow, Ethan wouldn't just be a new hire. Tomorrow, the CEO was going to start a revolution, one employee at a time. Seeds of revolt. Ethan arrived at Porter's Grill and go the next morning earlier than anyone else, except Melissa. She was already there, her slender figure hunched over the coffee machine, refilling filters with mechanical precision. The soft chime of the front door startled her head snapping up, eyes weary, and already bracing for whatever the day would throw her way. "Morning," Ethan said softly, stepping inside and letting the door close with a quiet click. Melissa gave a slight nod, not unfriendly, but cautious, like she didn't quite trust anyone who hadn't already proven themselves. That's what working here did to people, Ethan realized. It made them wary of kindness because kindness usually came with a catch. He wanted to change that, but first he had to see exactly how deep the rot went, learning the unwritten rules. Ethan spent most of that morning shift quietly watching, not just the operations, but the dynamics, the unspoken rules that governed every interaction between the crew, the customers, and Rick. Rule 1. Stay invisible. If you were working the front, you kept your voice low and your head down. If you were prepping food, you stayed behind the fryers, out of sight unless absolutely necessary. The less Rick noticed you, the better. Rule 2. Mistakes are punishments, not learning moments. When a new hire messed up an order, they weren't shown how to fix it. They were shouted at until they either corrected it on their own or someone else stepped in out of pity. Mistakes were marks against you, and enough of them meant your shifts got cut, or worse, you got written up for being inconsistent. Rule 3. Never challenge Rick. Ever. It didn't matter if Rick was wrong, and he was wrong often. If you questioned him, he'd make your next shift hell. Every employee had a horror story of the day they crossed him. Ethan didn't need to take notes. These rules were burned into the walls, into the worn-out tile floors, into the hunched postures of the employees who had learned survival was safer than standing out. The customers see everything. Mid-morning, the restaurant got a brief lull. That odd hour when the breakfast rush ended and lunch hadn't yet begun. A few customers lingered at the tables, scrolling through phones or finishing lukewarm coffee. That's when Ethan saw her, an older woman near the window, watching. She had no food in front of her, just a paper coffee cup she turned slowly in her hands. Her clothes were plain, the kind of practical wardrobe people wore when they didn't have much to spend. But her eyes took everything in. She wasn't a regular, but she was a witness. Ethan stepped out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron as he approached. "Morning, ma'am. Everything okay?" The woman glanced up, startled. "Oh, yes, fine." Her voice was polite, but her tone was guarded. "You been waiting long?" Ethan asked gently. "No, I'm just sitting for a bit." She smiled faintly. "My grandson works here, Kevin." Ethan's chest tightened. Kevin, the quiet teenager Ethan had seen Rick berate just a few days ago. "He's a good kid," Ethan said. "Works hard." The woman's smile faltered. "I worry about him. He comes home exhausted, and some days, he doesn't say much." Ethan sat across from her, sensing she needed to be heard. "Has he ever talked about what it's like working here?" She hesitated. "Not really. But you can see it in his eyes. That kind of tire doesn't come from just working hard. It comes from feeling small all day long." Ethan's stomach churned. She took a slow sip of her coffee. "I'm glad you're being nice to him. There's not a lot of that left these days." The breaking point. Lunch rush slammed into the store like a freight train. Families, teenagers, construction crews. The kitchen was a blur of movement, fryer baskets hissing, timers beeping, Rick shouting. But it was one small moment that tipped the scales. Melissa was at the counter, handling a long line of orders when Rick stormed out from the back, red-faced and seething. "Where's the damn ketchup stock?" he bellowed, loud enough to make a toddler at the nearest table burst into tears. Melissa flinched but didn't stop working. "I restocked it this morning," she said quietly. "Well, it's gone. Typical. You screw up everything you touch," Rick shouted, slamming a plastic crate onto the counter for emphasis. The entire restaurant went silent. Customers stared. Melissa's hands trembled around the register keys, her face flushing red. Ethan felt his fists clench so hard his nails dug into his palms. This wasn't just a bad day. This was the daily reality these employees lived with. Something inside him snapped. The first spark. Ethan stepped out from behind the fryer station and stood between Rick and Melissa, blocking Rick's line of sight. "Relax," Ethan said, keeping his voice low and even. "It's ketchup, not gold." Rick's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Ethan met his gaze without flinching. "Someone who doesn't like seeing people get screamed at over condiments." A murmur rippled through the employees nearby, a crack in the silence. Rick stepped closer, towering over Ethan. "You've been here, what, 3 days? You don't know how this works." Ethan's smile was cold. "I know exactly how it works. That's why it's broken." For a moment, Rick looked like he might swing at him, fists clenching, jaw tight. But there were too many witnesses, too many customers, too many phones that could start recording at any second. "Get back to work," Rick snarled, turning on his heel and storming into the back office. The moment the door slammed, the air seemed lighter. Melissa glanced at Ethan, her eyes wide. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "Someone had to," Ethan said softly. "Might as well be me." After the smoke cleared, the shift dragged on, but the tension had shifted. Employees stole glances at Ethan like they were seeing him for the first time, not as the new guy, but as someone who might actually have their back. Melissa caught up with him near the mop sink later that afternoon. "Why'd you do that?" she asked, her voice hushed. Ethan wiped his hands on his apron. "Because I remember what it's like." Melissa frowned. "Remember?" Ethan hesitated. "I worked in a place like this when I was younger. Had a boss like Rick. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth." "Did you quit?" "No," Ethan said softly. "I bought the place, and then I fired him." Melissa stared at him like he was joking. When she saw he wasn't, her mouth opened. But before she could say anything, Rick's voice barked from the office again. "Break's over. Get back to work." Melissa gave Ethan a wary smile. "Guess that's our cue." As she walked away, Ethan leaned back against the wall, heart pounding. The first spark had been lit, but sparks were fragile things. If he wanted to rebuild this place from the ground up, he needed more than sparks. He needed a fire. Tomorrow would be different. That night, Ethan didn't go home. He sat in his car, laptop balanced on his knees, typing up notes. Employee names, behavior patterns, key moments. Not a corporate report, a battle plan. Tomorrow, Rick would find out who Ethan really was. And by the end of the week, Porter's Grill and Go would be unrecognizable. Not because of new rules, not because of memos, because the man who built it was finally back where he belonged. In the fight, the mask comes off. The next morning, Ethan didn't dress in his usual undercover uniform. No faded polo, no grease-stained khakis, no worn work boots. Instead, he stood in front of his hotel mirror adjusting the tailored suit jacket he hadn't worn in weeks. The navy blue fabric rested smoothly across his shoulders, a sharp contrast to the calluses forming on his hands from hours spent scrubbing fryers and stacking boxes. The face looking back at him wasn't just Ethan Porter, CEO. It was a man who had seen his empire from the bottom up. And today, the people at the Harborville location were going to meet the man responsible for the paycheck in their pockets and the culture choking the air they breathed. He didn't just want to confront Rick. He wanted to start a reckoning, walking back in as himself. Ethan's arrival didn't cause a stir at first. Employees were too busy prepping for the breakfast rush, wiping down counters, and stacking sleeves of paper cups. A few glanced up, confused by the man in the expensive suit. He didn't fit here. That was exactly the point. Melissa was the first to recognize him. Her eyes widened, her hand freezing mid-wipe across the counter. Ethan gave her a slight nod, a silent reassurance that whatever happened next, she wasn't in trouble. Rick came out of the office, his expression already sour from whatever personal frustrations he had decided to drag into the store that day. The second his eyes locked on Ethan, confusion flickered, followed by suspicion. "Can I help you?" Rick asked, arms crossed over his broad chest. Ethan took his time, pulling off his sunglasses and tucking them into his jacket pocket. "Yeah," Ethan said calmly. "I'm Ethan Porter." The room went still. You could hear the hum of the fryer over the silence. Melissa's eyes darted to Rick. Kyle, the teenage fry cook, stood frozen, half a bag of frozen fries hanging in midair. Even the customers at the counter sensed something was happening. They leaned in, curious. Rick's face paled for a split second before recovering into a slick, corporate grin. "Mr. Porter, wow, what a surprise. I wasn't expecting. You weren't supposed to." Ethan's voice was calm, but it had the weight of authority Rick had never been on the receiving end of. Rick's smile wavered. "What brings you to our little store today?" Ethan set both hands on the counter, leaning in just enough that only Rick could hear his next words. "I've been here all week." Rick's forced grin froze, the color draining from his face completely. Ethan straightened, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "I've been working beside your team, watching, listening, and learning exactly how this store runs, and exactly how it doesn't." Melissa's mouth fell open. Kyle's bag of fries hit the floor with a dull thunk. "I saw how you treat your employees, how you talk to them, how you blame them for problems you cause with your own laziness and lack of leadership." Ethan's voice stayed steady, but the fire underneath it was undeniable. "You are, without a doubt, the worst manager I've ever seen in my career." Rick's mouth opened, but no words came out. "You're done here," Ethan said, his voice hard as stone, effective immediately. The fallout. Rick's bravado crumbled in stages. Disbelief, bluster, and finally, the realization that there was no escape from this. He spun toward the employees gathered around, looking for support, but found none. Even the ones who had once followed his lead were silent now. They had seen the truth. They had lived it. And now, they saw someone willing to stand up to it. "You can't fire me without HR." Rick tried, grasping at straws. "I own the company," Ethan said simply. "I don't need HR to get rid of a cancer." Rick's face flushed crimson, but he knew better than to push further. With a muttered curse, he stomped to the back office, grabbed his keys and jacket, and shoved past Ethan on his way out. The door swung shut behind him, the bell jangling loudly in the stunned silence. Ethan took a slow breath, turning back to the team. Rebuilding trust, one conversation at a time. Melissa looked like she didn't know whether to cheer or faint. Kyle stood with his arms hanging awkwardly at his sides, as if waiting for a new disaster to erupt. "Let's talk," Ethan said, his voice softer now. "All of you." The employees gathered in the dining area, sitting at tables they usually only cleaned. The silence felt heavy, not from fear anymore, but from uncertainty. "What happens now?" Ethan stood at the front, hands resting on the back of a chair. "I owe you all an apology." The employees exchanged confused glances. "I built this company," Ethan continued. "I wanted it to be a place where people could be proud to work, where we served great food, and where the people behind the counter felt respected and valued. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that." Melissa stared at him, her brow furrowed like she wasn't sure if this was real. "I got comfortable," Ethan admitted. "I trusted reports and numbers instead of trusting the people who actually run these stores. You. That was my mistake." He took a breath, scanning their faces. "I'm here to fix it, not just by firing bad managers, not just by making speeches, by listening." Right now." He gestured toward the room. "Tell me what's broken, and tell me how we fix it." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, Melissa raised her hand. "It's everything," she said softly. "The schedules. They get changed last minute all the time, and people have to cancel plans or scramble to find someone to watch their kids." Kyle added, "Training sucks. Half the time we get thrown on the line and told to figure it out." Another employee, a shift lead named Angela, chimed in. "It's the fear. No one wants to speak up because managers like Rick make you pay for it later." As the floodgates opened, Ethan took notes. Real notes, not corporate shorthand. Every frustration, every complaint, every idea. "I promise you this," Ethan said when they were done. "We're not going back to how it was. We're building something better, together." Immediate changes. By the end of the day, Ethan had a plan. Anonymous feedback system, active immediately. Guaranteed scheduling notice. No changes within 48 hours unless agreed by the employee. Mandatory leadership retraining for all managers, starting at the top. Employee recognition program, because the good work you do shouldn't go unnoticed. Melissa still seemed skeptical, but there was something new in her eyes. Hope, fragile but growing. "Who's gonna run this place now?" Kyle asked as the sun set. Ethan smiled. "For now, I will." The first steps forward. The next morning, Ethan was back. In jeans and a company polo, working the fryer, sweeping floors, filling orders. Not undercover this time. Just there. Side by side with his team. When a new customer walked in, Melissa greeted them, not with the forced monotone of before, but with something closer to a real smile. The shift wasn't perfect. Mistakes still happened. The fry timer still beeped too loudly. But the air was different. Fear wasn't the boss anymore. And by the end of the day, Melissa said something Ethan would hold on to for the rest of his life. "Thank you for seeing us." Ethan smiled. "I should have seen you a long time ago." Rebuilding the heart. Ethan Porter stood in the back parking lot of Porter's Grill and Go, hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans. The morning sun cut long shadows across the cracked asphalt, highlighting the weeds growing up through the pavement. He used to love this store, the very first brick-and-mortar location after his old food truck, the symbol of his dream-growing roots. He could still remember painting the walls himself, back when this building was nothing more than an empty shell. It felt almost poetic, standing here again. Only this time, he wasn't building a restaurant. He was rebuilding its soul. The first test. The day after firing Rick, Ethan held the morning shift meeting himself. The employees, most of whom had never interacted with corporate leadership outside of stale training videos, stood around awkwardly. Some leaned on counters, some crossed their arms. None of them made eye contact for long. They were used to leaders who barked orders and disappeared, not ones who stood shoulder to shoulder with them. "First off," Ethan began, "I'm not here to take over your store. You all know how this place works better than I do. What I want is your help fixing what's broken." A few skeptical looks passed around the room. "Some of you might think this is corporate PR," Ethan added, "that I'll be gone by next week. That's fair. I haven't given you much reason to believe me." He paused, letting the silence settle. "But here's the truth. I built this place, and then I abandoned it. I let people like Rick set the culture. That's my fault. And I'm here to make it right." The tension in the room eased, but just barely. Trust wouldn't be rebuilt with words. It would take time, action, and proof. Small steps, big impact. That day, Ethan worked every position, not as a boss observing from the sidelines, but as a crew member. He worked the drive-through headset, where the system lag frustrated everyone, including customers. By the third order, Ethan made a note to authorize an upgrade, something employees had requested for over a year. He stood on the line, where Melissa showed him how to wrap sandwiches quickly without crushing the buns, a skill Rick never bothered to teach. He swept the floors alongside Kevin, who slowly began to thaw, his initial wariness giving way to quiet conversation. "It's weird," Kevin admitted, "having someone listen." Each small moment mattered, not because Ethan was fixing everything at once, but because they saw him care. That was the first real change. Facing the fire. Of course, firing Rick didn't magically erase every problem. That afternoon, a corporate district manager named Claire arrived, summoned by panicked HR reports about Ethan's sudden hands-on management. Claire, a woman with a polished smile and a folder full of performance charts, met Ethan in the cramped back office. "Mr. Porter, I appreciate your passion," she began diplomatically. "But this approach has caused some confusion." "Confusion?" Ethan arched an eyebrow. Claire cleared her throat. "Managers are concerned about mixed signals. There's a process for addressing performance issues. Firing Rick without documentation." "I've seen enough documentation," Ethan cut in. "Numbers don't show me who's afraid to ask for help, who skips breaks to cover for missing staff, or who's being humiliated on the floor. Rick created a culture of fear, and I allowed it because I thought metrics mattered more than people." Claire hesitated, clearly recalibrating her approach. "I understand, but we have nearly 20 locations. You can't personally oversee each one." "No," Ethan agreed, "but I can change how we lead them." He opened a notebook, his personal log from the past week, pages filled with employee names, concerns, ideas, and small wins. "This," Ethan said, tapping the notebook, "is how we start. We listen, we respond, and we hold our leaders accountable." Claire glanced at the notebook, her professional mask faltering for a moment. She saw it, the messy, human side of leadership that couldn't fit on a spreadsheet. "I'll need your support," Ethan said. "Not just here, but across the company. We don't need better policies. We need better leaders." After a long pause, Claire nodded. "Understood." The ripple effect. Word spread faster than Ethan anticipated. Employees from other locations began whispering about the CEO who worked the fryer and fired a toxic manager on the spot. At first, it sounded like a rumor, too good to be true. But when photos started popping up on the employee app, showing Ethan shoulder-deep in sudsy dishwater or running orders in the drive-thru, people began to believe. At the Westfield location, the night manager called an impromptu meeting. "If corporate's serious about listening, maybe it's time we stop pretending everything's fine." At Lakeshore, a cashier posted a suggestion in the new anonymous feedback system. "We don't want free pizza parties. We want decent schedules and someone to have our back." The floodgates opened, rewarding the invisible. A week later, Ethan stood in front of the Harborville crew once again. This time, with certificates and envelopes in hand. "Recognition isn't about gold stars," Ethan said. "It's about making sure the people who keep this place running know they matter." He handed Melissa a certificate. Employee Leadership Award, along with a raise and her official promotion to assistant manager. "Not because you survived, Rick," Ethan said quietly, "but because you lead by example, every single day." Melissa's hands trembled slightly as she took it. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan gave Kevin the Rising Star Award, recognizing his quiet work ethic and eagerness to learn. "You don't have to be loud to be valuable," Ethan told him. "We see you." Each employee received something, personalized, meaningful, not just a gesture, but a promise. A new standard. 2 weeks later, Ethan hosted a company-wide virtual town hall. Employees from all 19 locations logged in, some from back rooms, some from their phones at home, others sitting cross-legged on break room floors. Ethan stood at a podium, the same suit he'd worn when firing Rick, now a little more comfortable on his shoulders. "We're not here to talk about quarterly profits," Ethan began. "We're here to talk about how we got lost and how we're going to find our way back." He outlined the new leadership expectations. Respect is non-negotiable. Training is a right, not a privilege. Feedback isn't a threat. It's how we grow. He ended with a simple promise. My office door and my email are open to anyone, not just managers. If you see something wrong, you have the right to be heard. Legacy reclaimed. 1 month later, Ethan returned to the Heartwarming store unannounced. The shift was busy, but the energy had changed. There was still stress. It was fast food, after all, but the air didn't hum with fear. Melissa stood at the counter, calmly handling a difficult customer. Kevin moved through the kitchen with confidence, calling out orders without hesitation. Ethan ordered a sandwich and sat by the window. Just another customer. No one knew who he was, and that was exactly how he wanted it. This wasn't about him. It was about them. The people who had always been the heart of Porter's Grill and Go. He had almost forgotten that. But now, he never would again.